Breaking: Ukraine stands firm, Russia loses ground, and a new global alliance may be forming. From Kyiv defense stance on defense to Syria drifting from Moscow orbit, the world is shifting fast. July 10th could change everything as world leaders gather for their coalition of the willing. Meanwhile, Russia faces fire at home. Drones strike near Moscow, Kyiv factories burn, and airports descend into chaos. I'm Zarislava Kolesnikova, this is Ukraine Today, and here's what the world needs to know. Stay with us. Can Ukraine be pressured into giving up its weapons, limited its army, or hitting its defense industry? Not a chance. Kyiv just sent a powerful message to the world. The armed forces will only grow stronger and no foreign deal will cut their power. As Russia pushed harder, Ukraine is ramping up production, looking in a new military partnership and building a defense wall no one can breach. Who helping? What's next? And how far will Ukraine go to stay battle ready? Stay tuned.
Attracting investment into Ukraine's defense industrial complex is Ukraine's main priority in all negotiations. That is why Ukraine will not agree to any limitations on its defense capabilities, stated Foreign Ministry spokesperson Georgy Tykhy. Earlier, President Volodymyr Zelensky announced the country's intention to ramp up joint weapons production with foreign partners. These steps are aimed at strengthening Ukraine's defense capabilities and bolstering its position in the security sphere.
We have reached an agreement with the American side on a significant increase in joint efforts. This week, an agreement was signed between our Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and one of the leading American companies. This will provide Ukraine with hundreds of thousands more drones this year under special terms and even more drones next year. In particular, interceptor drones. This is clearly our priority.
According to Volodymyr Zelensky, more than 40% of the weapons used at the front are now produced in Ukraine. There is also an increase in the production of artillery systems, armored vehicles, mines and ammunition. Ukraine is focused on two key areas, increasing the production of long-range weapons and manufacturing interceptor drones. According to the president, the use of modern technologies in weapons production will help contain the aggression of the Russian Federation and more effectively protect the civilian population from attacks. Putin, in turn, is seeking to hinder the strengthening of Ukraine's defense capabilities. That is why one of the Kremlin's conditions during the negotiations in Istanbul was a significant reduction in the number of Ukrainian troops and weaponry. Neither Ukraine nor its European partners agreed to this.
By the end of the year, we will supply Ukraine with 2 million shells. We have also invested more than 2 billion euros in strengthening Ukraine's defense right now, and the origin of this money is important. We are doing this by using the proceeds from frozen Russian assets. So in practice, Russia is paying for the weapons that Ukraine is using.
Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen has called for increased investment in Ukraine's defense sector in response to the latest massive Russian shelling of Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities. Let us recall that on the 1st of July, Denmark assumed the presidency of the Council of the European Union for the next 6 months.
The most obvious thing to start with is to invest more in Ukraine. They could probably produce twice as much military equipment as they do now if they had the money. Investment funds could be obtained from frozen Russian assets. And this is precisely the issue that Denmark is now specifically studying. Lars Løkke Rasmussen, Denmark's Minister of Foreign Affairs, in a comment to Denmark's radio.
The Ukrainian defense industry is capable of producing up to 10 million drones per year, said Defense Minister Rustem Umerov at a meeting with representatives of the German defense industry. According to him, the scale of Russian aggression continues to grow, so Ukraine and its allies are constantly seeking new effective solutions to strengthen their defense capabilities.
With proper funding, we can produce even more advanced weapon systems. Our goal is to establish effective cooperation. The government is ready to assist companies in finding partners in Ukraine and to directly participate in joint projects, in particular through co-investments and the creation of joint ventures. Rustem Umerov, Minister of Defense of Ukraine, on Telegram.
Ukraine intends to develop joint weapons production with Germany based on domestic military industrial technologies. This partnership is aimed at strengthening the defense capabilities of both countries. This concerns production in Ukraine as well as joint production in Germany.
Germany is ready to provide funding and to co-finance long-range fire systems that are produced in Ukraine. and the first systems should be available in the coming months. Secondly, we will provide funds so that the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian armed forces can purchase equipment from the Ukrainian defense industry.
Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine has significantly increased its weapons production. Today it has more of its own weaponry than ever before, reports the Wall Street Journal. And the development of Ukraine's defense industry is becoming a decisive factor in the country's ability to refuse to accept Russia's terms. Natalia Husova, Kamil Shamudinov for Freedom Television Channel.
A major shift in the Middle East. Syria, once a loyal Kremlin ally, is now turning west. In a historic move, the UK has restored diplomatic relations with Damascus, sending Foreign Secretary David Lammy to the Syrian capital for the first time in 14 years. What does it mean for Putin's crumbling influence in the region, and is Moscow losing?
For the first time in 14 years, the UK Foreign Secretary has arrived in Syria. David Lammy held talks with the country's transitional government, including Syria's interim leader Ahmed al-Shara and Foreign Minister Assad al-Shaibani. The visit took place 8 months after the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad's dictatorial regime. After sanctions were lifted in April, London has now confirmed its support for the new government, stating its readiness to assist in the country's reconstruction, fund humanitarian programs, and strengthen security.
I am here on behalf of the British people, who have always supported the Syrian people with humanitarian aid. I want to engage with the new government, urge it to continue being inclusive, ensure transparency and accountability in governance, as well as support the Syrian people and Syria in the process of peaceful transition in the coming months, and to further strengthen bilateral ties between the government of the United Kingdom and the government of Syria.
In May 2025, the Council of the European Union also adopted legal acts that lift almost all economic restrictive measures against Syria, except for sanctions that remain in place for security reasons. To strengthen ties between Europe and the new Syrian government, the foreign ministers of Germany and France flew to Damascus at the beginning of 2025. According to analysts, Syria is an extremely important country in terms of its location, and by gaining its favor, Europe could benefit economically.
Through Syrian this is of significant interest to both the Republic of Turkey and the European Union. Essential oil and natural gas pipelines could potentially be constructed, for example, originating from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which would effectively allow vital energy resources to be reliably delivered to Europe via these crucial pipelines. And it's clear that against this backdrop, we can say that the era of Russian energy resources in Europe will be over once and for all, because oil and gas from the Persian Gulf will simply be cheaper.
In addition to Europe, the United States is also intent on resuming dialogue with the new Syrian government. To this end, on the 1st of July, the head of the White House, Donald Trump, following the European Union, lifted economic sanctions against Syria.
This order supports the national security and foreign policy objectives of the United States by mandating additional actions, including the lifting of sanctions against Syria, issuing permits to ease export controls and other restrictions on Syria, and other measures that must be taken, without granting relief to ISIS or other terrorist organizations, human rights violators, those connected to chemical weapons or activities related to their proliferation, or other individuals who threaten the peace, security, and stability of the US, Syria, and its neighbors. From a publication on the White House website.
While Europe and the US are actively moving closer to the new Syrian government, Moscow is gradually losing its once key ally in the region. Before the opposition forces came to power, Syria was ruled by the dictatorial regime of Bashar al-Assad, who had governed the country since the year 2000. His ability to remain in power for so long was largely due to Russia's support. The Kremlin and the Syrian regime jointly terrorized the population. Bombs were dropped on peaceful cities, and brutal military operations were carried out. These became possible thanks to the presence of the Russian military contingent in Syria, particularly the Kyiv air base in the west of the country and the military port in Tartus. In 2017, Moscow and Damascus signed an agreement that allowed Russian forces to remain in Syria for another 49 years. However, after opposition forces came to power, the Kremlin lost control over key facilities. Russian troops began hastily evacuating equipment and the fleet.
Syria really was not just a hub, a military hub for Russia, and this hub served not only the war against the Syrian people, but was also a gateway to Africa, where Russian equipment was transferred from Syria to Africa. That is, it was first delivered to Syrian territory and then transported to Africa. And now there is talk that it will be quite difficult for Russia to find a replacement for these bases if they are asked to leave.
According to analysts, the loss of military bases in Syria seriously weakens the Kremlin's ability to conduct operations and exert influence on authoritarian regimes in Africa. Putin is trying to find an alternative to the Syrian hub, but there is no full-fledged replacement. Libya and Sudan, which could theoretically become new strongholds for Moscow, have already refused the Kremlin out of fear of a possible Western response, writes the Moscow Times. But even if these countries had agreed, insufficient infrastructure makes them extremely ineffective as a replacement for Syria. Nikita Skoblikov for Freedom Television Channel.
A high-stakes summit is set to take place on July 10th in the UK as France and Britain host a so-called coalition of the willing. President Zelensky will join virtually from Rome, while Macron and new UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer will participate from NATO's Maritime Command Centre. Who else will show up, and what will this powerful coalition mean for Ukraine's defense? Stay tuned.
Trump's special envoy is heading to Rome to discuss Ukraine's recovery. Keith Kellogg, according to Kyiv Post, is visiting the Italian capital, where an international conference will be held on Thursday and Friday. Who else will be part of the American delegation has not yet been announced. However, according to some media reports, Kellogg plans to meet with Volodymyr Zelensky. The special envoy of Trump thanked the Ukrainian president the day before, commenting on his conversation with the American counterpart.
Man, we also thank President Zelensky for his condolences regarding the terrible loss of life during the flooding in Texas, especially among the youth. Both presidents acknowledge the pain of losing young people, both in times of peace and in times of war. Compassion is a key part of leadership.
Correspondent. The President of the European Commission, the Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of Poland and other world leaders will also attend the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Rome. Meanwhile, the President of France and the Prime Minister of Britain will convene a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing via video link on the same day to discuss increasing military aid to Ukraine. In Paris, they also stated that the purpose of the meeting is to ensure the restoration of the Ukrainian army and the deployment, at the right moment, of forces to guarantee security within the framework of a possible ceasefire. Important for Ukraine. That's how President Zelensky announced this week.
Volodymyr Zelensky, we are preparing new decisions, new agreements with our partners that will make Ukraine stronger, both in defense and in recovery. Next week will be largely and extensively dedicated to the comprehensive recovery of Ukraine, to forging new and significant agreements with our international partners, and to a very great extent, to the complete and thorough restoration of justice for all.
Correspondent. This Wednesday, the European Court of Human Rights is set to deliver a verdict in the case of Ukraine and the Netherlands versus Russia. This is a consolidated lawsuit concerning human rights violations in the temporarily occupied territories of Donbass, including the illegal abduction of Ukrainian children, forced labor and torture, the downing of flight MH17 in 2014, and gross human rights violations during the full-scale invasion. Katerina Fedorchenko, TSN 1+1 Marathon, United News.
Explosions grounded flights and Elbnis airport lines. Russia's heartland is under pressure again. Overnight drone attacks rocked the Moscow region, with reports suggesting a hit on a chemical plant tied to the military industry. For the second day in a row, hundreds of flights were cancelled. Is this just the beginning of a deeper disruption inside Russia?
Russian propaganda channels report that explosions were heard in the Sergiev Posad district, while Ukrainian monitoring channels suggest that drones may have targeted the Krasnozavodsk chemical plant, which supplies the military industry of the aggressor country. Also, let us remind you, for the second day in a row, hundreds of flights are being cancelled. The reason is security measures following the overnight drone attacks. The authorities assure that the situation is under control, but passengers are still standing in long lines. And let's not forget that just recently the port of Novorossiysk was attacked once again. This is the base where in 2023 the Russians were forced to relocate the remnants of the Russian Navy fleet from Sevastopol after active strikes on the Crimean Peninsula, specifically by our drones and missiles. So the port of Novorossiysk became something of a refuge for the remnants of these vessels. How effective it actually was, perhaps we can ask Hennady Dubov, candidate of legal sciences. Hennady, welcome.
Thank you.
A combined attack was carried out on Novorossiysk. That is, both unmanned boats and sea drones and aerial drones were used. In fact, the local authorities reported that 120 supposedly Ukrainian drones were shot down by the local air defense. There is no official information about destroyed vessels, but some Russian telegram channels reported that several ships, including landing and reconnaissance vessels, were damaged. How do you assess such active drone airborne and maritime drone strikes, yes, on such very important targets in terms of their quantity? If, according to the Russians, 120 were shot down, then something definitely got through. And more than 120 drones at once targeting just Novorossiysk is already quite a lot.
Well, I can't answer that competently. I can only repeat what has been said by both the main intelligence directorate and the security service, that since we don't have a stationary fleet, we use the so-called mosquito fleet, or a fleet of unmanned vehicles or crewless boats. And in this regard, considering that the port of Odessa is operating, we can probably say that we have once again carried out a revolution, including in maritime affairs. Because today, not only in Ukraine, unmanned boats actually play perhaps an even greater role than the stationary fleet, as has been the case throughout human history. And as for the details, I certainly don't know. I'm not a military expert in this regard.
Well, we're not talking about a specific event, a particular date, or a destroyed vessel or tanker, but we are talking in general about our capabilities. Let's not forget that Novorossiysk is not just a shelter for the fleet, but also a commercial logistical hub specifically for transshipping Russian grain, metallurgy, and other products. So let's recall that there has already been a sixth incident in Russia's Ust-Luga. There, a tanker from the Shadow Fleet carrying ammonia was blown up. Let's talk about these repeated strikes, constant ones on oil refineries, on processing facilities, on everything related to energy resources. Well, this somehow still affects the state of the Russian economy. And this has been repeatedly mentioned by officials, yes, from the bank, from the Ministry of Finance, from the Russian Central Bank, that their problems are not just obvious, they already exist.
The thing is, in addition to the fact that Novorossiysk is indeed a hub for Russian oil transshipment, Kazakh oil is also handled there, and Azerbaijan is partially connected to the relevant oil product pipelines and oil pipelines. That's why the situation there is even more complicated from a global logistics perspective. And in the context of the Russian economy, it is much more important for us to understand how the so-called shadow fleet is doing. In other words, as we've always said, given their volumes, it's much more important for us to create economic obstacles. And there are, in particular, a lot of decisions by the National Security and Defense Council regarding sanctions against both Russian vessels and accordingly manufacturers that help fill the budget of the Russian Federation. Therefore, in this context, on the one hand, we really adhere to a comprehensive approach. On the other hand, the vote is quite complex in the sense that through Novorossiysk, products of extraction are transshipped, including by, for example, British owners. And in this regard, we always have to be careful because there are also partner cargoes involved. And that's exactly what we are doing. We do not attack ships that are operating in civilian mode and transporting non-military goods. And in this regard, we are focusing more on using economic levers to influence the relevant processes in the Russian Federation.
But you see any products that Russia sells abroad, one way or another, stimulate and finance the economy that supports this war and therefore help to finance the war further. This issue is perhaps even open to debate. Perhaps, we've already discussed more than once about anti-personnel mines and withdrawing from the convention. That war dictates its own terms, so maybe when it comes to economic damage and inflicting such losses, something needs to be reconsidered as well. But that's just a remark. Meanwhile, the Russian Federation is relentlessly looking for loopholes to circumvent the sanctions. And you mentioned sanctions. And here it's important to talk about the fact that we are finding new ways to continuously impose these various sanctions, whether on legal entities, personal sanctions, sectoral ones, and so on. We also need to find new opportunities to meet the needs of our military industry. However, all such schemes concerning Russian capabilities will be stopped. And this is what the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, is talking about. He noted that the relevant law has already been signed. We will listen to him now, and then you can comment.
I have signed a new sanctions package. These are special sanctions that target many Russian financial schemes, including those involving cryptocurrencies. Now, as many of Russia's usual financial channels are blocked, they are turning, among other things, to cryptocurrency transactions. Overall, today's package includes sanctions against 60 legal entities. And for each one, we will work with our partners to coordinate sanction source and those of Europe, ours, and those of other significant jurisdictions around the world.
Gennady Dubov, candidate of legal sciences, is joining us now. German Chancellor Merkel says that the 18th package will be promptly developed and presented. And Volodymyr Zelensky says that this special new package will be a synchronized sanctions package with our European partners. What, in your opinion, makes it special and how effective could it be?
From the perspective of our policy, we have come to the point where we actually aim to impose sanctions through our own unilateral decisions. And accordingly to then pass these sanctions lists on to the countries of the European Union so that they can in turn mirror our decisions and possibly even to the United States of America. This is undoubtedly more effective, especially when it comes to enterprises from the Russian Federation. Because when we talk about domestic Ukrainian sanctions, we have the ability to block assets that are located on our territory, since it will not involve international settlements, transactions, shipping, or anything of that sort. If, accordingly, the British do this, the Europeans do this, the Americans do this, then there are certain tangible consequences, or these consequences become possible, because we have also repeatedly emphasized that in addition to imposing sanctions in the European Union and America, it is also necessary to properly monitor their enforcement, because that same shadow fleet is, for the most part, still unrestricted in its movements. But in fact, we constantly insist that it is necessary to properly implement the decisions that have already been made. But one way or another, without making the appropriate decisions, without authorizing a number of campaigns, we cannot count on the implementation of this kind of mechanism. That is why the Ukrainian side has always insisted, and today we are probably on the home stretch in this regard, that after we make a decision within our own internal framework, a corresponding decision must be mirrored specifically by the European Union. And this, probably the 18th package, when it is adopted, will demonstrate the determination of our European partners, or it will not. Because forming coalitions of the willing is one thing, but fulfilling the commitments you have made is another. But we hope for the best.
Well, we are hopeful also in the context of the coalition of the willing, because there have already been statements about its peacekeeping contingent. Once again, this issue has come to the forefront after the ceasefire regarding the control of the situation by European deterrence forces. This is a very important issue, in my opinion. If it is going to be discussed, perhaps there will be some specifics. But the same goes for strengthening air defense. Perhaps these very topics will be raised by representatives from the UK, France, as well as Germany and Italy, who will join online. We will be watching closely. Thank you for joining the broadcast. Gennady Dubov, PhD in law, was our guest at this hour.
That's all for today on Ukraine Today. Don't forget to like, comment and share this video, and consider becoming a channel sponsor to help us keep bringing you the truth. Stay strong, stay informed, stay with Ukraine. See you in the next video, and bye for now.